Here we are. Okay. Hey, good to see you all. After a week away, and yeah, looking forward to hearing. Let's see, Christine is going to be our guide through some of this today. Actually, through both chapters. Thank you, Christine.
No worries.
I don't
I'm
see
partially sorry I
Christine.
said yes to both.
Yeah, who doesn't see Christine?
Oh, there she is, right in the middle.
There
Okay.
she is. You're worried. You're like, uh-oh, we're in trouble if Christine's not.
I'm here.
Could I have I have a request.
Have it.
Could we have a moment of prayer? Did you already have it?
We have not yet had it.
Okay. Could
But-
we have a moment of prayer?
Would you like to lead that moment of prayer, or would you like for
I'd like you to lead it. Thank you.
anything specifically that you would like me to mention in our moment of prayer, or just hold the space?
Mhm.
All right.
Yeah.
The Lord be with you.
And
Okay.
also with you.
Let's pray. Almighty God, we pray that you will grant us in this world knowledge of your truth, and in the age to come, life everlasting. Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
I think the best thing to do is just dive in and let Christine give us we'll go chapter by chapter again. So give us a little summary of what you take to be the salient features of the chapter on human beings. Get us started into some discussion, and then we'll move on to the next one when we've solved what it means to be human.
That's a tall order for today.
But save plenty of time, because after that we have to solve what it means to be Jesus.
Yes.
So, all right.
It's heavy lifting day. Okay, so for chapter 5, I feel that this chapter can be summed up in 2 words, connection and hope. And I've got some highlights from the chapter as well to go with that. So on page 69, Tony poses this question. If it is human persons who come to discover themselves in the presence of this stranger on the road to Emmaus, what does it mean to be human? And then here are some highlights as he explores the themes of hope and connection in this chapter. So first of all, there's the Great Hope section in which he talks about the desire of the little words, us, the little logoi, made in the model of the eternal celebration of joy-filled love, and our desire is to rest in God. And I also like the Small Hopes chapter, or section, I should say, and the fact that we talk about being grounded in our limits as created beings, grounded in the temporal space of creation. Tony describes this as our yearning for nearer experiences, so not the grand inrush of total transcendence that can be really overwhelming, but the smaller experiences of our incarnational selves. So finding our way home through community and connection, as illustrated in Marilyn Robinson's novels, such as Housekeeping. And I really was drawn to the fact that this can be described as an expansion of the realm of affection. And I thought there was a lot to be found just in that a particular phrase. Another important highlight of this chapter is loss and grief playing a part in our humanness. So loss and absence provide space in which we can discover ourselves. Tony draws on the Emmaus journey and the Judean exile, or the Babylonian exile, I should say. But I also was prompted, sorry, Daniel, to think of Bottom in A Midsummer Night's Dream in terms of loss and discovering oneself. And I'm happy to expand on that at some point. Another highlight I wanted to emphasize is page 75, where Tony states that whatever we are as humans, we are at our fullest when desire for presence is so intense as to be insatiable. And then, oh, sorry. Oh,
Where is that? Wherever we are, just which paragraph?
Oh, I'm just giving a highlight of, yeah. So I'm just drawing out a highlight from page 75.
Summary. Okay.
Where Tony states that whatever we are as humans, we are at our fullest when desire for presence is so intense as to be insatiable.
Looks like it's right on that page, Emma Jane. The first sentence of that paragraph.
Thank you. Community and connection are expanded on at the end of the chapter, using Alfred North Whitehead's idea of concrescence and combining that with Maximus the Confessor's thoughts on freedom, to note that love and faithfulness are the plan, with a multitude of invitations from God in which one can come to rest in God. I don't know if I've taken my whole 3 minutes, but that was my attempt to cram such a meaty chapter into just a little into just a little bit of time. And what this all really drew out for me in terms of wanting to discuss things. So on page 77, Tony frames the question of what God wants into how does this moment invite an unplanned event of faithfulness to God's eternal beauty? And so this makes me wonder about vocation. I'm in a vocational frame of mind at the moment, and thinking about how a person lives into their passion and how the church or how Christians frame vocation. And so I was hoping we could talk about that, along with what practices can help a person find community in their search to find those particular moments or to live into their passion. And also simply, how do you encourage another person to listen for those moments and respond to that invitation with a yes and, as opposed to an absolute no. So I hope that makes sense.
And you, Christine, can you restate the first question before you asked about practices?
I sure can. So so this makes me wonder about how a person lives into their passion, given this definition of being a human, and then how the church frames vocation.
And it would help me if you could say a little bit more about the origin and the thoughts that led you to that question. How the church.
Yeah. So when on page 75 in the middle of the page, you talk about that as humans we are at our fullest when desire for presence is so intense as to be insatiable. And the chapter it also talks just about looking for nearer experiences and wanting to find our rest in God. And so I find, I do a workshop called Holy Foolishness, which is about play and vocation. And I find folks really push back against living into their passion as anything other than, time to be earned, or maybe just to be dismissed. That vocation is something for clergy and people who are feeling a call to ordination. And I'm really influenced a lot. I don't know how many of you had a chance to take classes with Jane Patterson when she was teaching New Testament and other things. And so I've had a conversation with her too about vocation, and is it it seems to be perceived as something static at times. And so, wonder if this definition of being human would help us understand vocation and help others to understand vocation as something more fluid. Does that help a little bit more?
I get it. Those are good questions.
And so, yeah, that's what I was hoping we could talk about, and is it just grounded in those moments of insatiable presence, or when that desire for presence is so insatiable, and so how those things come together if you're talking about being human.
Yeah, great questions. Let's hear from somebody who's pondering these things with us.
So so Christine, listening to your question, my sort of initial response is the sort of hinges on the word passion. Part of what I'm wondering is if the vocation question is like a chapter in the sequel to this book. Like I think passion, as Tony is using it, and maybe I'm wrong, is in some ways like even a more basic thing. So like the moment, to call it a moment of like walk from Emmaus, is sort of this there's a kind of signal to it, there's a kind of fuel in it, there's a sort of a connecting with a deep desire, and I'm wondering if the vocation question is sort of like, a year, 18 months, 2 years after those folks take that 7-mile walk, they sort of notice the concrete habits and things that they've done that have emerged from the sort of the burning of the heart, and that those are the pieces that they build a vocation from, if that makes sense. So like with Jane, like a big thing with Jane was like, I remember her talking about school supplies one time, and like the pleasure of school supplies, and it was always very practical in terms of vocation. And so part of what I'm wondering is if the Emmaus disciples, sort of after having more testimony and having gathered more evidence, including from their own lives over a couple years, that's when you start to have something that does look kind of like a map towards vocation. I guess that's what I'm wondering. I guess for me, that the question is the word passion, as you're using it in the question, and the word passion as Tony's using it in the book, are the same, or is it the vocation question, is that sort of like follows from like a longer period of time in a concrete life, I guess. That may be wrong. I mean, because the Emmaus walk stuff, like it's clearly part of it. You know what I mean? Like it clearly is. Anyway, that's just my initial response.
That's good. So let's think about that for a second. Does the question of vocation belong in this chapter on what it means to be human, or does it belong in the sequel? Terry.
I think it does belong in this chapter. I mean, I guess I would want a definition of passion, because I often don't think that we acknowledge that we have multiple vocations in our lives. And at times they compete. And at times we're more passionate about them than others, but that doesn't mean that that vocation goes away. And we're called to give, just by the circumstances of our life, at times more energy to one than the other, regardless. So can you explain, did I understand? Maybe I didn't understand it correctly, but could you explain what you mean by passion there?
Yeah. So for me, I guess I equate passion with that desire for presence.
Yeah.
So something that is so much a part of who you are, for example, or for me, to use me as an example, to be willing to suffer for it in that sense of the word passion, but something that is very much at the core of who you are in terms of well, maybe I'm being tautological here in what you feel, what you hear God is calling you to be.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess for me that's and I go back to the is it Beekman or is it Thurman who talks about, you know, where your passion meets the world's needs.
Mhm.
And so I guess that's what sparked that in me with that phrase of we're at our fullest when our desire for
Mhm.
presence is so intense. So
So
yeah,
what
for me
about
it would be writing or talking about play or something or like that, but it might be different for somebody else. Does that
so
help?
what about when our identity and our desire is no longer, I mean, is not recognizable to us, but the
Yes,
shape of
yes,
our
that's part of this
life,
question
the
is like,
shape of our life is still that is our vocation. Um, you know, I mean, we just have competing vocations, and sometimes our passion is more at one than the other, but that doesn't mean our responsibility, once it's been established, goes away.
right.
I guess.
I like that answer, Terry, because that just gives me more to think about. And part of this also was inspired by a friend who is on the retreat staff for it's a retreat for clergy who want to do vocational discernment. And so I was curious about that and what that entails and um yeah, you know, and if you have a competing vocation. So
Like
or
being a, you know, being, I mean, look, there are some times in seminary where I had to spend a night doing a diorama as a mother. It did not matter.
right, yeah.
That may not have fit the call of other parts of my life, and it may not have been where my passion was at the moment.
Right.
Or, and in bigger ways, you know, the call of our families, the call of our, I don't know.
Mhm.
Yeah, I like that. Well, I think of you know, somebody who is a priest but also might be a blacksmith, for example, or you know, like where do those, are they competing vocations? Are they part of the same underlying vocation? You know, yeah, yeah,
Good.
sorry, I'm just curious about this because I,
Let's-
I
let's see.
think it's more important than we think.
Go ahead, Nan.
Well, this conversation makes me think of um, the earlier discussion where Maximus Confessor talks about at creation, humans are made in the image and likeness of God. And I loved what he said about the nature that we're given as gift, but then the habits of life where we grow into the likeness of God. And that maybe there's passion implanted within us, and then there's passion that develops over time. So there is that fluidity of growth, and maybe those passions over time grow closer together and deepen each other.
I'm making lots of notes and having lots of things to say, but I'm having fun listening to you all. So, Imogen.
Yes, thank you. Nan was going down kind of the way that I was looking at it. That Terry and Christine were getting into more of the language of vocation with the church, which was part of the questions, but then also, but the passion, and I'll just quote on page 75, where you say as a human person is what we call a being who blooms into life as a particular set of hopes and loves, that though small are unique trailheads into an infinite desire that she carries with her through her life. Oh, I love the way you write. That's so rich. And that to me is saying, when we are born, we're born with God-given gifts and passions in our hearts that create our very unique logi. Is it logi or logi?
Logoi.
Logi?
Logoi.
Logoi. I love that. I'm a logoi. And we are given that from the very start. And then our life is how we grow into that and how we use it and how it guides us. And I think that we, certainly find through our education, through our experiences, find all different ways to use those gifts, those passions. But I think that there's always, like, you can always come home to that one or two specific passions that make you who you are as a unique logoi.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for that, Imogen. That's when Christine was framing the question, and then Daniel reframed a question back at us from that. That was a sort of a loose connection I was starting to make, the one you were just making. That there's in a sense, sort of the big passion that is at the heart of what I'm trying to get at when we talk about what it means to be human. That's a universal, that's shared, that's like what we all want most of all turns out to be God. There's no like there's no bigger, more sort of all-encompassing desire than that, and it actually is what, whether we know it or not, what we all want, except that we all want it differently. Like there's this particularity to the way that desire takes shape in me, and part of that is maybe the God-given gifts that I begin with that are different than yours, and part of that is the way that my world has shaped me. And then the question is not how do I become somebody who wants different things, it's how am I, as the person who, with the desires that I have, how am I logoi, how am I little logos, how am I shaped like that big desire. And so I was connecting it in my mind as you were, Imogen, with the great hope and small hopes part that Christine summarized for us. There's a sort of there's a kind of a great passion, and then there's maybe a more particular vocational what did I say, passion. There's the universal passion, and then there's a particular passion, and the particular passions may be more like what we call vocation. And that's when I was using that image of the grandma and her seahorse pendant from Marilyn Robinson. It's a beautiful, it's a hard, difficult story, but it's a beautiful, just so much. Just I think she may be like half angel, Marilyn Robinson. This is my theory, but beautiful, powerful image that she's giving us of this grandma who, like, it's not that she ever chose to love those painted seahorses. She's become a person who loves nothing more than that. I mean, she loves other things, but she loves nothing more than she loves to look at that pendant. And she loved it so much that Robinson tells us, even when she's looking at it, she's still longing for it. It's like, I haven't desired it as much as I possibly could yet. And that makes me a little bit sad, even when I've got it open and I'm looking at it. And I just think there's a powerful image in there of both the universal, the universal passion, what we want is God, and we could never finish desiring God. But there's also this powerful image of the particularity of that vocational passion. I don't love painted seahorses and a pendant. I have not been shaped as someone who cannot even, doesn't even sort of feels a little bit at loss in parlor conversation because she wishes she were looking at her seahorses. That's not the way God has shaped me, but God has shaped her that way. And so her sort of life vocational question is, how do I be this person who loves what I love and discover the way that that is patterned on the big love that we all share for God and the big love that in which God created us. How is my love for this particular way of life shaped in and held by that? Somebody had a thought in there at some point. Jared.
This makes me think of you wrote love and faithfulness are the plan, and what we do is this unscripted paraperformative response. And so like when I think of vocation and what we're talking about, especially with people in my congregation, they hear the word vocation, they're like, okay, what makes me come alive when I'm like when I plug into that passion, that means I have to pursue, like quit my job to pursue my vocation. And like when I read love and faithfulness are the plan, and what's up to us is this unscripted response, like there's not a particular script outside of love and faithfulness, right? There's so I can be a banker and also pursue my love of barbecue, because I feel connected to the love and faithfulness of God when I do that, because it helps me in community with other people or feed other people, right? Like like Christine mentioned the blacksmith, and I know she's talking about our alum Jeremiah Griffin there in New Mexico, who's a priest and a blacksmith. And I'm so glad Jeremiah didn't say, I'm going to quit the priesthood to pursue my vocation of being a blacksmith. I think there's something really wonderful and freeing to say there is no script, but there does need to be a participation in love and an ever deepening sense of faithfulness to God and community in my life.
I probably mentioned to some of you that I once told a room full of like a giant room. I was a chapel speaker over here at St. Andrew's Lower School, lower. And I told a chapel full of middle schoolers that God had no plan for their life. And like as soon as it came out of my mouth, I was like, ooh, maybe discretion there. But it was that the point of, I mean, but my next line was something, I can't remember exactly, but it was something like, because you are the plan. Like what God has made in you is a being who can love and desire and pursue and grow and connect and be faithful and hope. That's the plan. And then the thing that feels like it needs to be God's plan, what choice am I supposed to make next? That's maybe a bit like the Emmaus disciples there, where they think they know what they hope for, and they're devastated because they didn't get the thing that they hoped for, which was for their Messiah not to be crucified. But what Jesus has to help them see is the things that God has given you to hope for are all like they're in process of being shaped, like the hope that God has called you to, something like that. Let's have maybe any other thoughts about this before we move on to the next chapter? Yeah, Kevin.
So I think if I were to get this answer in a counselor's or priest's office, I would leave the office utterly dismayed, but feeling like I'd been given a non-answer. Maybe.
That's the only kind of answer theologians can give. That's just, that's a vocational hazard.
Not to the theologians.
But if the second person of the Trinity is the Son that is recognized by the Father, using the language of the creation chapter and the prodigal son, and it is the Son's response to the Father that demands or calls forth the creative urge, and we are little logoi, then it would seem that whatever that call is that recognizes us from afar and that compels us to beseech the creative response in God and ourselves, which is ultimately our full becoming and is never static and is never singular one thing, then passion, vocation is that which is what calls us, and as well as what behooves a response in manifestation from us in response to God. But I would just leave it at that. And I would walk out of the office utterly dismayed, having been given a non-answer.
I'm looking on my on my little participant box to see how I make clapping hands, but I don't see how to do it. That's what I was looking for, though. I like that a lot. I've been in my prayer life this year. I've been experimenting with a kind of I don't know exactly what to call it, but it's something like Trinitarian contemplative prayer. And it's what Kevin's saying is making me think of it. It's a quiet, mostly wordless contemplation, but attending, as a lot of contemplative prayer does, attending to breathing, but intentionally shaping the breathing as well, in one way of saying it is breathing as if I were the second person of the Trinity. And my breath in is the gift of being that God has given me. And my breath out is the, how do you say it, Kevin? Something like the creative practice of becoming that I return back to God. And if some sense that's just who God is as Trinity, and that's what God means by making us little logoi, then that's like the stuff of life, is to receive our being and gratefully give back a becoming. And I think that's also where that all that particular vocational particularity gets built back in. Like I'm gonna be this logos in an unscripted way that's never been done before, because nobody has ever loved seahorses like I love seahorses. But I'm gonna receive everything that I am, and I'm gonna also become everything that I am as I sort of go back out toward God. Christine, want to move us on to God Human?
Yeah, chapter 6 on God and Human, which I think we've already started moving into. So I had 2 words to summarize this chapter also, metanoia and revelation. I think they go together really nicely. As Tony discusses of how Christians might identify Christ. And so some of the things that I wanted to highlight from that are the idea that, so why I think metanoia and revelation go together here is early in the chapter where Tony talks about that moment in Emmaus, and then I think talks about Plato and other literature where the person discovers the true identity of the stranger, and then which then causes the person who sees that new identity of the stranger to turn, and not only to turn, but to unlearn as well, and then to relearn perhaps. And I thought as Tony went on to talk about, the fact that Jesus does not tell people who he is, but rather asks. I thought a good way of putting that was that Jesus is asking people, what story would you tell about me? And then the other thing I really liked about this chapter is there seems to be, just as in chapter 5, at least for me, there's a lot of improv ideas floating around in here. So like with the Syrophoenician woman especially, I think Tony uses the word, says that she over accepts Jesus, so that's definitely an improv word. But she what I like about it is, in terms of improv, she just takes that story, that narrative from Jesus, and draws herself into it. And here's the passion word again for me. Her passion for her daughter, I would say, allows her to do so, and allows her to see both Jesus and herself in that moment and not flinch from it. And you kind of talk about that as you go further into the chapter. And I want to compare her with the disciples, and being blinded, because they seem to just see the end of the story instead of taking over the narrative and drawing themselves into it. They're just at an end, and that's a huge loss for them. And they just have a hard time getting over it and seeing past it. And so in essence, they're blinded until they're able to, like on the road to Emmaus, when Jesus reveals himself, and helps them figure out that new story. And then the chapter kind of takes that turn, maybe almost a sonnet-like turn, by beginning to talk about humans then finding that courage to face themselves. And from the ability to face ourselves, I hate to say ourselves, but and being able to accept all of your humanness, maybe both the good and the bad, and something new is revealed. And Tony uses the phrase poesis to talk about that as just, butterflies in a cocoon, something that hasn't existed before. And I love the fact that he uses Dante's Divine Comedy to do that, and the poet's desire to see the face of Christ. I think that is such a really good example. And I'm sorry I don't have the page number, but that quote about the pilgrim must first face self and learn or unlearn what it means to be human, and tying that to lived experience rather than just, I'm not even sure what the opposite of lived experience is. Exactly. I don't know if I wouldn't just say passivity, but yeah, you have to live into this and not just wait for it to come to you, perhaps. One of the conclusions in the chapter is that Jesus is not only human, but Jesus is the true human. And we already touched on this in discussion a little bit. I think Tony said, but for me, it's like good writing, a specific word that only works in a given sentence. So whatever is specific then can become universal. So the incarnation has to be in a specific place, such as Israel, or I like Dante's image of the human colored circle, to become something that is larger than just itself. And the fact then that means that Jesus is not two natures in a single body, but the Spirit bearing witness in us that in this man a human life is lived in such a way that that in him is divinity, power, holiness, and impassibility, which I love those four qualities. And so those are the highlights that I took from this, again, very meaty chapter. I'm not sure I got it all So I don't necessarily have a specific discussion question. Other than I kind of wanted to explore the idea on page 91 of Jesus's remarkable deification being ours as well. Because, yeah, I'm not sure I totally understand that enough to frame it well for the rest of y'all. Yeah.
On page 91, Christine?
On page 91, yeah, you talk about the, it's not quite the end of the chapter. Oh, yeah, it is. So at the top of page 91, so it kind of follows from 90 to page 91, where you talk about we don't turn to Jesus to see two natures lived in a single being and what that looks like, but we turn to Jesus because the Spirit bears witness in us that in that man, a human life is lived in such a way that whatever one can see in him is divinity, power, holiness, and impassibility.
Yeah.
And that if that Spirit is alive in us, Paul notes, Jesus's remarkable deification will be ours as well.
Got it. Yeah,
I need some help with that.
that's a great place to start to focus. What sense can anyone make out of what in the world the author might be trying to get at in this idea here?
I just have a question, I guess, along these lines. I keep reading in your stuff that, we're little Christs, we're little boy, we're working towards the divine because the divine calls us. As Augustine says, our hearts are restless until they find a rest in thee. And I've listened to your talk, and while I was listening to it, you said at one point we participate in the divine. And I'm great with that. But becoming divine, that theosis, I have a problem with.
Yeah.
Like on this side of heaven, and even on the other side of heaven, I don't think I can become God. I can participate in God, though, and I love that part. Could you speak to some of that?
Yeah, I could. This is, I think, exactly the right worry. I think there is I think it's got a pretty good theological answer, but I think it's exactly the right word to have. Because theosis, deification, divinization, sanctification, all those sets of words really are ways of trying to get at what we imagine the ultimate end, temporally, cosmologically, ontologically, what we imagine the ultimate end of creation to be. And like most Christians will say some version of participation in God. Not everyone uses that language, but most will say what Susan, what you said you're comfortable with. When you read Maximus or Aquinas or Augustine or these folk, Gregory of Nyssa, these folks that, as you all know, I want to hang out with in heaven and have snacks with. They do this extreme move that I'm trying to sort of exegete a bit here, where where I say, look, if salvation is about finding new depths of human flourishing in myself and in my life, then maybe I don't need to say Jesus is God. I can just say Jesus is the ultimate human and be done with it. So what is it that's pushing them to say Jesus is God? And the answer actually happened. The answer turns out to be the way that they understand sanctification, theosis, deification, divinization, the way that they understand the end of creation, which is ultimately we are not called just to become better versions of the creatures we are. Ultimately, we are called to, and I'm going to use the offensive term, ultimately we are called to become God, or gods. And they'll say it either way. And the reason that I think that that is the right thing to say, even though it burns my ears a little bit, is because God is not a, like what I think you're worried about, Susan. What I worry about is that the sort of don't I think there's a distinction between creator and creatures? Do I think that eschatologically there won't be a distinction anymore? And if that's the worry, that's what I mean. That's exactly the right worry. And I think we have to say, yes, there is always a distinction. One way of understanding that distinction is to say, God is one who is, creatures are ones who become. God is, creatures become. Terry's over there smirking because she wants to pull some Whitehead out here. So we'll maybe talk about that if we need to. But I'm gonna say, God is, creatures become. And so then when I go back to that offensive sentence, and I say we are called to become God, I'll even say it the most offensive way: we are called to become God. Like I ought to sort of immediately get the joke. God can't become. To be God is not to be one who can become. So maybe that means to be a creature is to be united with God in the way that only a creature can be united with God, which is to become God. Like what would a becoming God look like? Maybe the saints, you know, maybe just like the pathway of deification is what becoming God looks like. Because if I just want to say, but then if I say what does being God look like, well, then I've got to talk about who God is that I never am, but I'm always coming into. And so when I say participation, I sort of, that's what I mean by that. Becoming participates in being. Creation participates in the creator. And that pathway towards becoming, there's nothing else to become except God. And yet becoming God doesn't mean we ever finally say, and now I am God. I've made it. Daniel.
So you're setting us up for failure. Just mess with you.
Always.
No, no.
Kidding.
Daniel, go ahead.
To connect, I think the line that Christine left us with, the bottom of page 90, top of 91. Thus one does not turn to Jesus to see what two natures lived in a single being look like. One turns to Jesus because the Spirit bears witness in us. Then in this man, a human life is lived in such a way that whatever one can see, et cetera, to try to connect that to Susan's point in a ad extra / economic kind of way. So I think part of when we speak Christianese, like part of what we're doing is the word Jesus, the name Jesus, it sort of becomes a pronoun that has two antecedents. One of them is God and one of them is human beings. So when we make a sentence that said Jesus does this, we're referring to two things at once. When we push that into the when we approach that idea or that framing of it with the worry, well, time out. How can I become God? How can I be divine or whatever? I think the category of testimony is actually helpful here, because the name Jesus, the way its gravity sort of pulls all of this meaning to it because of what people said about Jesus. It said when we say Jesus, we have two antecedents: human beings and God. Well, when Susan does a saintly thing and hears a confession or exhibits love to someone, when that person tells the story of their encounter with Susan, the name Susan has two antecedents, a human one and the one of God. When that person talks about their life and their experience of Susan, there isn't a difference between I experienced a human and I experienced God when they tell the story of Susan comforting them or whatever. It's in the testimony that the two natures are sort of revealed. And because we can speak that way about Jesus, we can also speak that way about each other in the way that we have encountered each other. So a couple months ago, I had one of those conversations. My spiritual director's name is Linda. And it was one of those conversations where she just like freaking ruined my life in all the best ways, you know, and she just like said all the stuff. And it's like, when I talk about that conversation, it was God talking to me. And it was this human woman who lives in Colorado talking to me. Like, the name Linda has both God and a person as an antecedent, just as when we say Jesus, there is a divine and a human antecedent. So when we frame it that way, the divinity stuff is a little less tricky, if that makes sense.
Okay. I love a lot of things about that. One of the things I love about it is it lets it takes theosis language out of the abstract, sort of eschatologically futuristic, like someday somewhere. And like, Daniel has seen theosis because he's met Linda in Colorado. That two antecedents is something that we can bear witness to now, and then we can say, and what we are seeing there is a human becoming God. We are seeing participation in God at a really rich to a really rich degree. And if I can acknowledge that, then some sort of transformation is happening in me as well. It's really good. Kevin.
So just something Daniel said spurred this in me, and so I'm shooting from the hip. I'm not really quite sure I'm comfortable with what I'm about to say, but until I say it, I haven't known what it is. So, hey, it's fun for both of us. From a neuroscientific point of view, and I recognize that just beginning that way, I have the analogical interval to have to cross, and I don't quite know how to do that. But as one person listens to another person with empathy, the experience of neural integration occurs in both minds of the speaker and the listener, and both of them are affected. And from a neurological standpoint, there is no such thing as individual minds, because all of our minds are interacting with one another. Implicit memories, explicit memories, little ticks of an eye are causing us to sort of key off of one another. In the experience of the risen Christ over time, it would seem, and again, this is where I'm spitballing, I don't know here. It's fun for both of us to find out what I'm about to say. In that experience, there is an integration. Or in the experience of the integrations with all other individuals that we're encountering, we become one, in a sense, one mind with them in that moment. So it would seem that, consistent with the notion of an all-loving, all-good God, that integration, that humility which condescends or which raises up, which calls forth, and which is welcoming of our response back, you then become one with God, and thus are, in a sense, God. But I don't know if that answers the question.
No, it's really good, and I like the connection you made to the analogical interval language, because that's maybe another way at Susan's question is we being integrated into the person of Christ. That is what it is for us to become deified with Christ's deification. And that means we are God, but we are not God in a way that ever crosses that analogical interval. Like, being sits on one side and becoming sits on the other. And becoming that's my funny shape drawing I had in the video, which is supposed to be I don't know if I said it in the video, but it's supposed to be like the sides of a stacking doll, of a Russian stacking doll. Did I say that in the video, or did it just look like two S's that were kind of, okay, I did say it. I did in class one time, and they're like, why are there two S's with an arrow between them? And I was like, oh yeah, I didn't explain that very well. But what I like about that image is if you have those two, so here are the sides, can you see? If you've got we are the internal one, we are the internal one. We're not the same as the one that we're located in, but we are shaped by it. And if we weren't shaped by it, we wouldn't fit. So there's this sort of, this is my image right in here. This gap is the analogical interval, where we never become the ultimate stacking doll, but we also do, because that's who we are. That's what shapes us. So I have found that language of analogical interval. Some of you've heard me use it before, but I found that to be really useful language for saying both how we are God and how we're not. I'm gonna say one thing, and then I think if I have time to say that, yeah, I'll say the one thing. That language that Christine was quoting from, and that we've been batting around a little bit, is some of that language is a quotation from Gregory of Nyssa, in a really, I think, really moving, and also many would say problematic text that he wrote at the end of his life. I think it's awesome, and when he edges right close to heresy, I'm kind of like, yeah, you got to get that close to be as awesome, to say the awesome thing you're trying to say. What he's doing in that text is he's getting at this very question that we're batting around. He's getting at this question of, what does it mean to look at Jesus, recognize that he's a human like we are, to lose ourselves in that in the same way we can lose ourselves in a relationship with a human, and then say, this one is God. And he's challenging a position that's very close to Nicene orthodoxy, which is Apollinarianism. Apollinarianism says, yes, Jesus' body, real birth, real human birth, all of that stuff. He's also God, and the way that you work that out is you say that, I mean, there are various versions of it, but the main version is you let the divine logos replace the human soul. And that's how you make sure that you get both God and human together in one. What Gregory thinks that misses is, I can't wait to read what Sarah I just put in the chat. What Gregory thinks that misses is Christ's deification. He thinks when we look to the person of Christ and we contemplate his love for others, his care for others, his righteous anger, all of it, that's not a human thing that then we need to somehow replace by a divine way of acting and knowing and loving and getting angry. That's what it looks like when a human is becoming divine. And if we can contemplate Jesus' love and anger and all of that, and lose ourselves in the contemplation of that, what we find is that whatever, how does he say it? Whatever you see of Jesus turns out to be divine. And this is where it gets close to, people will critique this because it's almost like, well, then do we lose the humanity at the end after all? But I think that misses the point, because he's saying, no, I'm standing. It's like he's in this image, he's standing there looking at Jesus in the ascension. And he continues to look at him even when he can no longer see him, which is it's a bit like the ending of Dante for me. He's standing there looking at Jesus even till he can no longer see him, but he's never stopped looking. He doesn't say, okay, now that I can no longer see Jesus, the humanity's gone and all I have is divinity. No, all I was looking at is the human, And I've gone so deeply into that human expression of holiness that I find that it's all divine. And so it's this, and that's why at the end I say we're not thinking of Christology right if we're thinking Jesus is the one person who goes around holding on to two natures. Because the divine and the human are not, in the same way that I think I said the thing the other day that you can't, like, eternity and time can't be like separate plots in the same yard, because one's eternity. Like divine and the human can't be two different kinds of the same thing that somehow stick together, because all the human is a participation in the divine. So if I can lose myself in that contemplation of the human, whether I'm talking about Susan or Linda or Jesus, at some point what I've lost myself in is contemplation of God. That was too long, but Jared, go ahead. Final thought.
Oh man. Well, after that, I don't know, but I just want to say something that grabbed me, and it has to do with Gregory of Nyssa and that passage where you talk about Gregory of Nyssa. With one of the things the incarnation means is he's standing there with the Acts of the Apostles and in the company of Peter and Salome, and there's no distinction, right? There's this sense of community, of connectedness, and things done humanly in a God way and things done godly in a human way and all that. And I just loved that. And it reminded me of, like, things von Balthasar, he talks about one of the things the incarnation means is that it reversed our understanding of nature. Like, we're no longer can consider ourselves just one soul, one spirit, one essence. Like, there's something about being human that is communal. And that passage for me just exploded off the page, and I loved it. Plus, we have All Saints coming up, and I think I may work that in there too. So I just wanted to thank you for that. I thought that was pretty rad.
Yeah, thank you, Jared. Thanks for saying that. Man, yeah, fun stuff happening here in the chat too. We got some Eucharistic theology. We got some Julian. Hey, y'all, this was good. Wish we could keep on talking. I'm having so much fun. But we'll try it again next Thursday. Yeah, come back if you can, and thanks for joining us today. Bye-bye.